Hi everyone, and welcome to this extremely special seminar that's going to be conducted by Professor Tony Press and his worthy team of panellists, Indi and Bruno. This is a joint event by the University of Tasmania's College of Arts, Law and Education and the Australian Institute of International Affairs. I'm Kim Boyer, I'm the State President of AIIA. And on behalf of both of us, I'd like to welcome you here today, and I'll just find my right words, and particularly as a reflection of both AIIA and UTAS's recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the AIIA and the University of Tasmania wish to acknowledge and thank the traditional owners, the Palawa people, and as custodians of the land on which we meet, and pay respect to their elders, past and present. We also pay respect to the elders who are seeing us from afar, or whose land we are zooming, and where we are reaching by technology rather than in person, but our hearts are with them. This land always was, always will be, and has never been ceded. So over to the webinar. I'm not going to actually, in introducing Tony, read his large biography, because if we did that, it would take too much time away from the valuable insights that both Tony, Indi and Bruno are going to have about the about the Antarctic Treaty and its challenges as we move forward and its robustness as we look back. Tony's an adjunct professor at the Institute of AIIA, where we're meeting today, and part of the Australian Antarctic Program Partnership. All these are words, but that doesn't actually indicate the huge international and national status that Tony holds in terms of all things Antarctic, both in terms of policy, in terms of politics of the broadest sense, and in terms of science and climate science. We're really lucky to have someone like him in our midst, and at the end of this particular lecture, I have huge pleasure on behalf of the National Australian Institute of International Affairs, presenting Tony with a prestigious fellowship of our institute. He's only the second Tasmanian who's actually been awarded a fellowship. The first one was Peter Boyce, who most of you will remember very fondly. So I think he follows in very able footsteps. So Tony, over to you. And I'm not introducing these two because Tony's going to make them introduce themselves.
Did you just pick up my notes? Thank you. It's a great pleasure, really, to be here and to talk on behalf of the Australian Institute of International Affairs and the very active Tasmanian branch, and to represent the university as well. So thank you for that introduction. There's just a slight echo there. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we stand, but I just want to note the passing of Galarrwuy Yunupingu. I had the privilege, I should say, as well as pleasure, of doing some work with Galarrwuy many years ago in Kakadu and East Arnhem Land and with the Northern Land Council. Australia has lost a very great person. Okay, so this little talk of mine is going to be a very personal reflection on my journey in the Antarctic and the Antarctic geopolitical space. I'll try and keep the acronyms to a minimum, but there's one acronym that will keep on coming up, and that's CAMLR. And for those who don't know, CAMLR is not some weird Antarctic beast. It is in fact the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, and its executive secretary is somewhere here in the room. And it's one of the most important components of the Antarctic Treaty system. And I'll save about 5 minutes if I say CAMLR rather than the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. As I said, this is quite a personal journey, but I've made it with some absolutely fabulous people. Some of them are in the room, some of them aren't. And my contribution is really their contribution, and I thank them. My initial focus will be on Australia's navigation of two important issues: the early fight against illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, IUU fishing in the Southern Ocean, and the submission of Australia's extended continental shelf data off the coast of the Australian Antarctic Territory. And the reason for that is that they were both quite difficult geopolitical issues to address, and the latter was extremely controversial. I officially took up the reins of the Australian Antarctic Division as its director in November 1998. Before then, I'd been given the role of Commissioner, Australia's Commissioner to the Commission on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, and in late October 1998. The Commission that year was grappling with the issues of illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing in the CAMLR area. And at that meeting, the then Minister for the Environment, Robert Hill, attended and spoke forcefully to the Commission about the threats of IUU fishing to toothfish stocks, and urged the Commission to negotiate and implement a catch documentation scheme as one of the tools to regulate the international trade in toothfish, illegally caught toothfish, and to combat IUU fishing. The context of his intervention was that a failure to act on the depletion of fish stocks would, quote, mean that CAMLR would be failing in its primary objective of conserving Antarctic marine living resources. It would also undermine the credibility of CAMLR as an effective international organisation. At that time, IUU fishing was being conducted by nationals of CAMLR members, such as Russia, Spain, and Uruguay. And the trade in IUU toothfish was facilitated through ports in Namibia, Mauritius, Hong Kong, China, Malaysia, and Singapore. It was big business, profitable business, carried out in the shadows of international and domestic law, and with direct impacts on Southern Ocean ecosystems, especially depletion of albatrosses and petrels, and it was significantly impacting the reputation of the Antarctic Treaty system as a whole, not just CAMLR itself. I'll return to that subject after a little diversion. 1998 was also a big year in Australia's Antarctic program. On the 22nd of July, 1998, Aurora Australis had an engine room fire during its first winter voyage to Antarctica. The voyage was abandoned, of course, and the ship returned to port for repairs. Fortunately, no one was injured, thanks in a large part to the extraordinary conduct of the crew, the voyage leaders, and the expeditionists themselves. Then, to welcome me into my new job, which I actually officially took up on the 23rd of November I was given another literal baptism of fire. The repaired Aurora Australis set off on its austral summer duties to encounter propeller damage. I think the term is it was stuck in forward gear and couldn't go backwards. It was in the ice. It had to be repaired internally. There was no other way of repairing the vessel. And eventually we organised for the Japanese Antarctic icebreaker Shiraz to come in and break Aurora out of the ice, at least to create a path for Aurora to get out of the ice, and which it did, and it was towed out of the ice by the Shiraz. It was then escorted by another vessel to Fremantle for repairs. The escort was in case it broke down again in the wild Southern Ocean, but it didn't need to be towed. And then, after it was repaired, the middle of January, turned around to set sail for Antarctica again and had another engine room fire. And that was my first couple of months in the Australian Antarctic Division. The A factor is real sometimes. 1998 was also an important year in the history of the Antarctic Treaty system. The Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty came into force on the 4th of October 1998. 10 years earlier, Australia had sent shockwaves through the Antarctic Treaty system by announcing, along with France, that it would not ratify the Convention on the Regulation of Antarctic Mineral Resources. After nearly a decade of discussions and negotiations, and having actually signed the convention in Wellington, Australia walked away from Antarctic consensus, potentially putting a wrecking ball through the edifice of the Antarctic Treaty System. If you want to read an excellent ripping yarn about that, Andrew Jackson, graduate of PhD, graduate of this university, has written a book called Who Saved Antarctica? It's available online. It's a fabulous story because it actually traces the personal interventions of people in that whole process of the demise of the Minerals Convention and then the extraordinary turnaround. And the turnaround was extraordinary because in less than 2 years, the Antarctic Treaty parties negotiated the Environmental Protocol. It was a huge diplomatic success and, as Andrew says in his book, a triumph of consensus. I'll return to that subject towards the end because there was a reason why it was successful. And that's a subject that we should be thinking about now for the future. Returning to the subject of IUU fishing in the Kamilar area, New Zealand had called towards the end of 1998 a meeting of responsible ministers to be held at Scott Base in Antarctica in early 1999. This meeting came to be known as the Ministerial on Ice, and it helped build much of the political momentum needed to prioritise action to combat IUU fishing. The assembled diplomats and ministers agreed to pursue two broad measures: the construction of a catch documentation scheme and related trade and port control measures, and the implementation of a vessel monitoring scheme for Kamilar members' vessels. in the area. These agreements and the subsequent ones associated with them are among the most important decisions made in the Antarctic Treaty System in the first decade of the 2000s. And they've had ramifications for international fisheries forums and trade bodies since that time. And they were heavily driven by Australia through creative thinking, through leadership, and through hard and soft diplomacy, intense international negotiations between governments and government agencies, and the engagement of ministers at the political level. Both of these measures were adopted by CAMLR after intense negotiations, out-of-session special meetings, and the pressure of hard diplomacy aimed at particular CAMLR members engaged in IUU fishing, and with states outside of CAMLR engaged in the trade of illegally caught toothfish. There are many other things in the CAMLR arena that I could cover here, such as the dramatic success of measures to eliminate incidental mortality of seabirds and other bycatchers. But I really must go elsewhere, to the Antarctic Treaty for a while. In early 1999, I was briefed by two of my staff, one of whom was Andrew Jackson from what was then the policy branch of the Antarctic Division, about the implications of Australia's obligations under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and the Australian Antarctic Territory. The Australian government was in the process of gathering the data it needed to define Australia's extended continental shelf. But the Australian Antarctic Territory wasn't included in that exercise. Jackson's proposition was that the Australian Antarctic Territory be included, and that the government should secure the minister's agreement to go to Cabinet to get the resources required to gather the data to define the extended continental shelf of the Australian Antarctic Territory. I'd have to say Andrew's boss didn't share his enthusiasm about this idea, but we decided to give it a go. And we knew at the time that it would raise more than a few eyebrows amongst Antarctic treaty parties. There was some toing and froing between the Environment Minister, Robert Hill, and the then Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer, about who would have carriage of this initiative. Downer wanted to do it, but he didn't want to carry the cost savings that would have to be found in order to do it, because at that time, no new policies could be developed unless they were offset from within the budget. So he handballed it to Hill. And Hill had the task of securing cabinet agreement. Well, Hill did get cabinet's agreement, and he did manage to do it without having to offset the $45 million that was required to gather the data. That offset was actually given to the Department of Finance. And the Department of Finance had to find the money, which of course departments of finance can do quite easily, but to also run the project. Now, there was a reason for us doing this, and the legal reason for doing this is that Australia had signed the UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Convention, in 1994, and in 2004, the 10-year deadline for defining extended continental shelves was looming. Australia's legal analysis was that it was legally more secure to meet the 10-year deadline than to let it slide. And seeing that we were one of the first countries and the first Antarctic country to have to submit data within a 10-year deadline, we took the running on this. So there was a timeline, and this is, we're talking 1999 here, having to submit the data by 2004. It wasn't an uncontroversial decision. The first take that many Antarctic Treaty parties and some Australian academics, legal scholars and NGOs took was that it was a breach, that this would be a breach of the Antarctic Treaty's Article 4. It would be an extension of a claim, which is prohibited under Article 4. I can see you shaking your head over there, Marcus. And of course, the legal opinion that we had was that it wasn't, but we'll talk about that later. Australia was portrayed once again as being a disruptor of the Antarctic Treaty system and a troublemaker, particularly by the US, of course, who had the US and Russia have a particular position, which is that they reserve the right to claim any or all of Antarctica, and that reserved right is protected by Article 4 of the Antarctic Treaty. So, but they also have an externally stated view that there are no, that Antarctica can't generate a maritime zone. As Australia was the first cab off the rank among Antarctic claimant states, there was a great deal of interest among them as to how this whole thing would play out. And the USA and Russia as parties that reserved right to make Antarctic claims were really quite taken aback by the announcement that was made public in late 1999. There's a whole book to be written about this, including certain lunches in Washington. But I want to concentrate on a few key elements of this saga to demonstrate how Australia didn't break the Antarctic Treaty system and how Australia was able to navigate a difficult, complex, domestic and international environment to secure Australia's national interests, but also to maintain the integrity of the Antarctic Treaty system. The first component of that success was a whole-of-government approach by Australia. Hill took the proposal to Downer, to the PM, shepherded through Cabinet, and then got Cabinet unified on how to deal with it. Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Australian Antarctic Division, the Attorney General's Department worked very closely together to scope the international legal aspects of the proposal and its legal legitimacy. Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Australian Antarctic Division work closely together in international diplomacy. DFAT resources were applied directly both to the legal aspects of the extended continental shelf submission and to the extensive international diplomacy that was required to ensure that a dispute wouldn't arise inside the Antarctic Treaty system. Australia worked very closely with the claimant states in meetings that never happened. That is Argentina, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway and the United Kingdom, and also with Russia and the United States. So there were meetings of the 7, the claimant states, and then the 7+2, which was Russia and the USA. Meetings were held in The Hague when there was a special meeting, Antarctic Treaty meeting. They were held in various locations around the world at different times, and they were held in the margins of all of the Antarctic Treaty system meetings like Kamala and the Antarctic Treaty itself. Among the claimant states, the United Kingdom and New Zealand were furthest away from Australia on how to deal with the matter of extended continental shelves, and they sought a solution that would see claimant states exempted in one way or another from having to submit data to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. Argentina, France, Chile and Norway were more closely aligned, or much more closely aligned to Australia's position. And they were looking for a proposal that would allow the data to be submitted. And a lot of work done between Australia and Argentina on the final solution, Bruno. Many meetings were held, but they were held with the caveat that Australia would give no surprises, that any decision the Australian government would make that was different from the last decision, or that would vary the last decision, then we would let the other countries know. By 2003, the Australian government concluded, based on legal analysis and advice, that submission of the Australian Antarctic Territory data to the Commission would be in Australia's best interest and would be the only way to protect Australia's interest. But that had to be weighed against the fracturing of the Antarctic Treaty system. Here's where besetment in the ice in Antarctica actually has a benefit. There's one of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade lawyers was stuck in the ice for 6 weeks in Antarctica and spent his time thinking deeply about the legal aspects of this submission of data and the interaction between the law of the sea and the Antarctic Treaty System. And he came up with a brilliant idea, and that was that Australia would collect the data, it would be able to use the data itself to define an extended continental shelf if it wanted to, and that it would submit the data to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, but it would ask the Commission to not look at the data for the time being. And that is the proposition that was taken eventually to the seven plus two, as well as the Antarctic Treaty parties as a whole. And so 2004 was spent doing a great deal of international work. I think I went in one trip. I went Sydney, London, Paris, Oslo, London, Washington, Buenos Aires, Santiago, and then hobbled my way back through London and Oslo to Tromsø. So there's a peer and foreign affairs people from were engaged in all of those discussions. There was a lot of diplomatic, intellectual, strategic and legal resources devoted to making sure that we could protect our interests and bring the Antarctic Treaty parties along with us. And that became, that modus operandi became the way that other Antarctic Treaty parties eventually, when they came to the other claimant states, I should say, Antarctic Treaty claimant states, it became the modus operandi. for their submission of data, and there were a form of words that were used that was agreed amongst the parties to deal with that. Just briefly, the first 2 decades of the 20th century saw 2 things occurring in the Antarctic Treaty System: a consolidation of sorts and the emergence of new forces and influences. On consolidation, the establishment of the Antarctic Treaty Secretariat was a great success. The annex on the liability for damage to the Antarctic environment was negotiated. The consolidation of practices around environmental impact assessments and the environmental protocol under the environmental protocol were agreed. The emergence of the Committee on Environmental Protection as the engine room of the Antarctic Treaty System, the development of intersessional working groups and other bodies to support better decision making, consideration of climate change and its impact on the Antarctic environment, and research and monitoring, particularly capacity building amongst Antarctic Treaty parties, and things like multi-year work plans, and also an uptick in inspections of Antarctic facilities, particularly environmental inspections. Inside Kamilar, exemplary work was done on reducing incidental mortality in Kamilar fisheries, particularly the seabirds, but other species as well. The success of measures against IUU fishing, the development of environmental domains as a framework for marine protected areas, agreement on the framework for declaring marine protected areas, and MPAs in Antarctica is not all a bad story. It's a difficult story now, but it's not all a bad story. Establishing a trigger framework for small-scale management of the krill fishery is vitally important, and the professionalisation of the Kamilar Secretariat. The way the Kamilar Secretariat does its work these days is exemplary compared to the way it did its work back in 1998. It's a little bit more complicated these days, but that, I think, is a major achievement of the Antarctic Treaty System, actually. Okay, so back again to 1998 before I move on to the current period. The 1980s had seen an increase in parties acceding to the Antarctic Treaty and becoming consultative parties, including India, China, and the Republic of Korea. This coincided with the negotiation of the Antarctic Minerals Convention, followed by its failure to enter into force, the rise of public environmentalism through non-government organisations and activists such as Jacques Cousteau, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The world was a very different place then, and it was effectively unipolar. One of the tangible impacts of the dissolution of the Soviet Union was they stopped their obstructionist behaviour inside the Kamilar Commission, and that's where progress was made on establishing precautionary catch limits in many of the fisheries and establishing and developing ecosystem-based management. Here's an example where changes in geopolitics result in a resetting of the dial in Antarctic affairs. So as we head into the middle of the 21st century, the Antarctic Treaty System faces new challenges and changed geopolitical environment from that was there in 2000. Here's a short list of some of the challenges that the Antarctic Treaty System faces. The first is climate change. The globe is facing the challenge of climate change. And in Antarctica, it will be intense. Holding global average temperatures to 1.5 degrees will impact heavily on Antarctica itself. It'll mean challenges for environmental protection, conservation, sustainable fisheries, and Antarctic governance in general. It will lead to loss of continental ice, especially the West Antarctic ice sheet, and significant glacial retreat in East Antarctica. It'll mean changes to fast ice, changes to sea ice cover, and changes to distribution and density of sea ice. The loss of the glacial ice shelves themselves, the sea ice, will have impacts on Antarctic species. For example, penguins. That's being measured and studied at the moment. And the loss of terrestrial ice will have impacts on terrestrial species and facilitate the introduction of alien species into Antarctica. Changing ocean temperatures, temperature profiles, and chemical composition, such as ocean acidification, will directly affect marine species distributions, productivity, and viability in ways that we're only just starting to understand. We've got hints, but we don't really know what those trajectories are going to be, either for species or ecosystems as a whole. These changes in the physical and biological characteristics of the Antarctic Treaty will also pose governance challenges to the whole of the Antarctic Treaty system. For example, CAMLR applies to the marine living resources south of the polar front, and climate change will mean that some species are going to cross those boundaries, may do so sooner than we expect, and we may end up with lucrative commercial species like tuna inside what is now the CAMLR area. And so there'll be a whole bunch of governance challenges around this regime, the Antarctic Treaty regime, the regional fisheries management organisations, and specialist organisations like tuna commissions. Climate change will also have impacts on commercial species such as toothfish and ice fish and krill. I'll now direct my last focus to specific geopolitical issues. And I was looking back at an editorial in Nature and a letter to Science written by Julia Jabor, Marcus and myself almost over a decade ago. And this 2018 editorial in Nature, which both led to the assertion that the Antarctic Treaty system is not fit for purpose for the 21st century. I challenge that. A common but thankfully not universal theme in think tanks and some academic circles is that the Antarctic Treaty is not fit for purpose for the challenges of the future. This is often matched by a heavy focus on Antarctic mineral resources, on militarisation, dual-use technology, and the year 2048, which is the 50th year after the Environmental Protocol came into force and the time at which a party can call a review conference for the protocol. I'll just dissect that last statement. Mineral resources. There are mineral resources in Antarctica. Some of them are hydrocarbons. Some of them are what you'd find in Tasmania or mainland Australia, because they once joined. None of them have ever been defined as commercially viable. But they could be. But that's at some point in the future. My point is that there's an indefinite ban on mining in Antarctica. It doesn't expire in 2048. And there will have to be a geopolitically completely different world for that minerals ban to be overturned. It's much more likely that you'll get a rogue player like Elon Musk or someone like that coming in as a disruptor to look for precious earths or something like that. Then you would have an Antarctic Treaty party breaching the ban on mining, and overturning the ban on mining is very difficult. Militarisation, grey zone, and dual use. I think this is an area that we need to look at, not because all of a sudden people are setting up military bases in Antarctica, but because technologies these days allow for uses that we're yet to actually fathom, and sometimes we're finding these new uses by accident. I think that militarisation, grey zone activity and dual use is best combated by enhancing the inspection regime of the Antarctic Treaty, which was in 1958, when it was agreed, the most progressive inspection regime in existence. And I think we should be putting strong diplomatic and legal efforts into revamping that inspection regime to ensure, to give mutual assurance among all Antarctic Treaty parties that technologies in Antarctica aren't being used for military purposes. And then there's the whole thing about 2048. I might sound sometimes as if I think the Antarctic Treaty is invulnerable. I don't. I think that if we are complacent, we will drift into a set of domains that we're not used to. Norms will change, practices will change, and we won't be able to get back to the point at which we can be assured that all Antarctic Treaty parties are at least in the same tent. And that's where we need to be. And the only way to get there is to provide the diplomatic, legal, and personal leadership and effort to do exactly that. That has to be done. In responding to these things, we have to make sure that Australia doesn't set, Australia and our like-mindeds don't set the agenda that makes some of these things inevitable. We have to be on the front foot. We have to be working with our like-mindeds, but also with those Antarctic Treaty parties that might have different views than us about where we should go in the Antarctic Treaty system. Now, I'll finish off, before handing over to Indi Hodgson Johnson and Bruno Arpi, I'll finish off with 3 points that any of you that are interested in looking at geopolitical futures of anywhere, but Antarctica in particular, look for soft signals. What are some of the things that are happening now that might point to future events? Soft signals are really important. Think about the black swans. Think about the unexpected. Think about the what is it that you weren't even thinking about that might happen. Now, you can never predict the future. Geopolitical projection is not prediction. It's actually about setting up scenarios that allow you to test your own ideas, to test the methodologies you might use to combat a difficult situation. And always remember that the past is not really a very good prediction of the future. And with that, I'll hand over to Indi Hodgson Johnson, who will introduce herself. No, let her talk there, and Bruno.
Right? Cool. All right. Hi everyone, my name is Indi Hodgson Johnson and I'm a adjunct senior researcher here at IMAS, and I study Antarctic law and policy. And in my day job, I'm a Chief Operating Officer of one of the science programs here, the Australian Centre for Excellence in Antarctic Science, which is just wrangling researchers all day, which is why I'm going great at my apparently young age. I was asked to talk about Australian sovereignty in Antarctica, which is something that is quite controversial. And when I was doing my PhD, it was quite lonely because I didn't get to go to conferences and talk about it because people don't like to talk about it. So obviously disputes about sovereignty are really one of the most vexed things that happen on the planet, and we've seen it play out at the moment in Ukraine. And Australia has two major roles in Antarctica. Its role as an Antarctic Treaty consultative party and its role as a claimant state, which Tony's talked about in terms in the context of continental shelf, and its role as a leader in the Antarctic Treaty. So I'm a huge advocate for the treaty. I go to the meetings each year. It's all about extraordinary international cooperation, as you heard with the Japanese vessel that broke out Australia's vessel when it got stuck down there. But for some reason, the second you start talking about sovereignty in Antarctica, you're not an advocate for the treaty. And that's not true. The treaty actually deals with sovereignty very elegantly, and there's entire book chapters, which are probably incredibly boring to most people, about Article 4 of the treaty, and it respects each party's position on sovereignty, whether or not they're a reserve claimant like Russia and the US, whether or not they're a non-claimant state, whether they are a claimant state. So anyone who wants to talk about that ad nauseum, you can come and talk to me afterwards. But I thought tonight I'll talk about bringing more of this national identity into the dialogue, and how perhaps we could do that perhaps a little bit more respectfully than some of the think tanks and some of the academics that do challenge the work that perhaps I do. And that's listening to the challenge that Tony has discussed, and how we could talk about more as Antarctica as part of Australia and part of the Australian Antarctic Territory, which is part of Australia, but you can also respect that as part of the Antarctic Treaty claimant, Antarctic Treaty Consultative Party role as well. They go hand in hand. So way we can do that, and way we can talk about that respectfully is, is that right? You want to hold that? Yep. It's about the domestic policies and the domestic legislation. There's a lot of short-termism about the way that we do talk about science. We've got a decadal plan coming up for science. It's a difficult area of domestic policy that we've had, and it doesn't lend itself well to the story of Australia's role in Antarctica. So I think improving that as a country is something we need to really face. And when I say that, I'm not talking about that cultural cringe we have about flag waving and making stamps and putting flags and tractors all over the continent or anything like that. What I mean is more a fundamental connection that we can have to the country. So I see in this room lots of people that have been involved in Antarctica for many, many decades. And it's a huge part of their life. Tony here, we've got Marcus, we've got so many people. And I think we really need to get to that stage of maturity in academic discussion as well as policy discussion, where we start talking about the administrative, the legislative and the judicial side of Antarctica and Australian Antarctic Territory, and not have that cringe about it, because it's a legitimate part of our conversation. And I think we're getting there. And I think I can see that over the horizon with some of the ways that I've seen the policy discussions happening. And so I thought with the invitation tonight with Tony and some of the things, Tony's been a mentor for me, and congratulations for your fellowship tonight. I thought that maybe we could have a starting point there, and any questions on that would be really welcome later on, and maybe questions to Tony, challenge him a bit on that. That'd be great. And I'm going to hand over to Bruno. He's going to introduce himself.
Thank you, Indi. Thank you, Tony. That was a great presentation and also a great response. And so it's a real pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you, Tony, Kale, and the Australian Institute of International Affairs for the invitation. My name is Bruno Arpi. I'm from Argentina, and I'm a PhD candidate here at the University of Tasmania. So, Tony, as a response to your presentation, I want to highlight two interrelated points. So first, why the ATS is facing unprecedented challenges. And the second point is why it's important for countries such as Australia or even Argentina to discuss and talk about the current and the future of the ATS. So let me first say something very briefly about the current challenges of the ATS. So geopolitical tensions are not new in Antarctic governance. We all knew that several geopolitical tensions have shaped the development of the ATS. Even the Antarctic Treaty was adopted during the Cold War. So the Antarctic community has always been able to manage those geopolitical tensions. So why is it different this time? So I believe that this time is different because for the first time, it's possible to see at the global level an attack by several countries on the principles and institutions developed under the post-World War II order. And the Antarctic Treaty system is an important part of that order. So the previous challenges faced by the ATS, were under a more stable and predictable order. This new multipolar, more complex and more unstable order poses some unprecedented challenges to Antarctic governance. And in relation to this, the second question that I would like to raise today is, why is it so important for countries such as Australia or Argentina to think and discuss about the ATS in the current international environment? Well, we all know that the Antarctic Treaty system promotes values that international society desires, such as international cooperation, peaceful use of Antarctica, security, even the environmental protection of the Antarctic environment. However, in relation to what Indi just said, we must also highlight that the Antarctic Treaty system is very important to safeguard Australian and even Argentinian rights and interests in Antarctica. We must not forget that Australia and Argentina are two states with territories in Antarctica. These territories are an integral part of these countries. And we know that the Antarctic Treaty has put aside disruptive arguments over sovereignty, but Argentina, Australia, and the other claimant states have not renounced or abandoned the sovereignty or the rights that arise from that sovereignty. Argentina and Australia are both bicontinental states in the sense that they both have territories in Argentina in South America and in Antarctica, and Australia have territories in Oceania and in Antarctica. So Australia is also a bicontinental state, and they are even neighbors, geographical neighbors at the South Pole. So this new geopolitical environment in Antarctic governance forces countries such as Argentina and Australia to assess how they will manage future and current geopolitical tensions in order to safeguard first the principles and values, the important principles and values of the Antarctic Treaty system, but also how they are going to protect their rights and interests in Antarctica. For these countries, Antarctica should be a key priority, as it is, for instance, the Indo-Pacific region. So more than ever, it's important to look towards the south and cooperate with like-minded states to address current and future tensions in Antarctica. The new geopolitical scenario in Antarctic governance is calling for a more active involvement of countries from the south. Throughout his history, our friend Tony has contributed to these debates, and his contribution has been extremely important. So I want to conclude by thanking Tony for all his effort and commitment in highlighting the importance of the ATS and also the protection of the Antarctic environment all these years. We need more people like Tony in this world. Thank you, Tony.
Thanks, Bruno. Thanks, Indi. And thank you, dear friend Tony. We've got about 8 minutes for questions. Well, it depends when the Zoom runs out. That's the issue. So basically, my colleague Greg is going to look at the online questions. So we'll start with any questions from here, and please make them brief. Gosh. Okay.
Do you think that the runway, the airport runway that Australia was wanting to build, the concrete runway, was a stamp on the Antarctic? Was their stamp, meaning that we're doing this, we're going to be the first?
Look, I'll jump into that one. Well, we certainly wouldn't have been the first, and the idea of building a runway, or the idea of having improved intercontinental air transport system to Antarctica actually came out of a report that I wrote a number of years ago. I still think it's important that we do improve our intercontinental air transport capability, because I think it's important not only for science, but it's important for human safety as well. And the answer doesn't have to be a runway at Davis Station. But what the answer is still has to be discovered. There are new technologies that exist now that didn't exist, new aircraft technologies that exist now that didn't exist when I wrote my report almost a decade ago. There was a question over there.
Yep, just an online question. Hi everyone, great presentations tonight. Can the ATS deal with climate change, for example, happening outside Antarctica? Or do we need a new protocol similar to the Montreal Protocol?
Okay, oh, sorry guys, I'll field that question. it's not the Antarctic treaties or the Antarctic Treaty System's job to fight climate change. There's already a comprehensive international agreement and agreements to do that. I do think the Antarctic Treaty parties should be more engaged in talking about the implications of climate change for Antarctica and ensuring that the Antarctic's voice is present in those discussions, because I believe that 1.5 degree global temperature target will have pretty disastrous effects in various places in Antarctica, but it isn't the Antarctic Treaty System's job to fight climate change.
Are you with me?
Thank you very much. And thank you, Tony, Indi and Bruno, for terrific presentations. Thank you. One of the things that's happening in terms of capacity building in the various global systems is to try to distribute resources better across all parties that might be engaged in a particular instrument, rather than coming with only a few or coming from only a few. One of the successes of the Madrid Protocol, of getting it into place, and then the subsequent decades, was the greater engagement across all parties in the Antarctic Treaty System, rather than just only a few. And I worry that at present it's coming down to only a few that are interested. Is it time for some centralised inspection agency through the Antarctic Treaty, or some enforcement and inspection agency in Camilla, such that the rich nations can contribute to it, but all nations can have engagement with it in terms of inspections and so on?
Setting up another body is a very difficult thing to do. I would say. I do believe that there are ways of doing that without negotiating a new instrument. But I think we're getting close to the point where new instruments or similar things like that might need to be done with tourism. So I tell you what I'll do with that question, Andrew. I'll slot it into the work that a few of us in this room are doing on modernising the inspection regime in Antarctica. That's a very interesting point to raise, and I don't have a formulated answer. Do you agree?
Can I just say that? Oh, sorry, Indi. I was just going to say that looks like another seminar coming up.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, well, I think the bilateral agreements that have been made, between Australia and France and things like that in the IUU fishing world have always been quite effective, but I know there's been pushback in the CAMLA regime about those sorts of things. So yeah, lots of work to do, but yeah, let's think about it.
There's a question just very quickly. Is increasing the inspection regimes a difficult task?
Yes. Yeah. Under current circumstances, it is, because usually inspections are done by visiting a place in person. There's one person in this room that was responsible for an aerial inspection, which is available under the Antarctic Treaty, by hanging out the back of an aeroplane and taking photographs. Phil Tracy. I think that we should be looking at aerial observation, the use of remotely sensed imagery, and modern technologies as a part of the inspection regime. And my initial reading of the law around this is that they are valid. But that's also a discussion to be had, and that's a part of the work that people around here are interested in doing.
Thanks for the great presentations. Just following up on Indi's comment about the Australia-France arrangements, I agree with the intent. This comes back to Tony's point about Australia's commitment because in a sense, France has been carrying the burden because we seem to put a lot of our marine assets up north. If we're really serious about this, we need to think about our more broader commitments, including putting our Southern Ocean capable patrol boats and assets on there. For those people who don't know, this is an Australia-France agreement on surveillance and enforcement, which allows a French vessel to have Australian fisheries enforcement people to arrest vessels under Australian law. But for the last 10 years, we haven't really held our bargain up. And to me, it's a really indictment on our focus on things that may be politically important, but not significant in the global the other arrangements. But thanks. That's a comment rather than a question. Well, you've got to say no comment. Oh, no. Put a question mark up.
Last question. Can the, I believe this is the question, can the ATS deal with Antarctic tourism?
I'll hand over to Ellie Lee. The answer is I think it can, but it has to make a few decisions in the next little while before Antarctic tourism grows to such a point that it becomes difficult to make international agreements on it. And I'll just leave it at that. But there's also a great bunch of people here who are studying Antarctic tourism. Katie, many people.
Okay, thank you. I think unless there's one pressing question from the floor. Oh, okay, he's withdrawn. So that brings us to the end. There are two things I have to do. The first thing is to thank Tony, Indi and Bruno very much. I just thought when we're neighbours in the Antarctic, we could be neighbours in the soccer field, given that Argentina has a lot to teach us. and Bruno doesn't let us live it down at our AIIA meetings about how successful Argentina's been. But on a serious note, people who are interested in joining the AIIA and who aren't members already, we'd love to have you. We have great events like this. We have great people. Now, before we all clap, everyone, I just want to give Tony his extremely important fellowship. These are rare as hen's teeth. They're also extremely heavy. Congratulations, mate.